Sarah Federman. I am a graduate of the doctoral program at the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason University. And this talk is based on a presentation I gave at Columbia University in December 2015 at their Politics of Memory conference, meaning how we remember the past and the politics involved in commemoration of the past. And what I did in that talk, what I'd like to do with you today, especially because my work involves research in France and what's happening in France right now and in Europe more generally, in our world more globally, is how we can use the past and memory of the past to really have the conversations we need to have to end and interrupt these cycles of violence in the present. Now, I'm going to be talking about France specifically because that's the area of my research, but yes, this does apply to Europe and it applies to the United States and other countries as well, but I'm going to focus on France. And a number of the Holocaust survivors that I've interviewed and the French Jewish leadership with whom I've spoken have told me that they really believe, France has done enough to make amends. And ultimately, have we really done enough if second and third generation Jews are leaving France at impressive numbers to Israel and other places? And if people don't feel safe in France generally, have we really upended these cycles of violence? Political theorist Vivian Gibri talks about the origins of violence, whether it's war or just violence in our communities, comes from these dynamics of inclusion and exclusion. Who feels in, who feels out. And when certain groups feel excluded, and I'm sure you can think of examples actually in your own life of when this happens, when someone or something feels excluded, there is oftentimes a backlash about that. So the question is how to really handle this question of inclusion. And France has a reputation for not taking kindly to immigrants or not integrating them well. Europe as well. And London obviously does a fairly good job, but it's been difficult for Europe to really find a way to do that and retain its identity. And it is a conundrum. But I'm saying that this is very important to have this discussion. I think and I hope that these discussions are increasingly being had because what Hannah Arendt says in her book called The Human Condition, if we don't create public spaces where we're talking about the problems of inclusion and exclusion or having some democratic voice about what's happening, what it creates is a space for totalitarian ideologies to move forward. So where you're seeing this in France today is Marine Le Pen, who's head of the National Front Party, which is the most conservative party in France, and for a number of years was really seen as a fascist party, has started to evoke narratives of impurity. Okay, so this may make you think of the Holocaust as well, pure blood. So who do we want to have a pure France and get down to like what is the true France? And Time magazine pointed this out very powerfully in an article in December 2015 about how when France colonized, it really tried to make other people French. That was part of the intention. In addition to kind of taking resources and finding cheap labor, this idea of making people French was really a major part of it. And even it reflected on the fact that in French school systems today, it's as much for children to learn how to be French as it is to learn the different disciplines. So when Marine Le Pen evokes the Marseillaise and calls her citizens forth, she's calling forth a national anthem that is arguably the most anti-peace, violent, and exclusionary national anthem maybe in the world, says Johann Galtung. It talks about spilling the impure blood of invaders. This is kind of what she's saying about returning France to the pure France and getting rid of those who aren't signed on to be French. And Le Pen's growing popularity shows that she's not a voice in the wilderness. There's a number of people in France who are really believing this. And again, this is not uncommon, especially in times of violence and in fear. People kind of pull back to these binary good and evils, pure and impure, right? Sorting out who's good and who's bad, and then quickly getting rid of the bad people. And what I'm arguing, based on Vivian Gibri and Arendt and my own research, is that we really need to talk about these dynamics of inclusion and exclusion. So what does this have to do with commemorative sites, and why am I locating this in commemorative sites? Well, those who have done scholarly work in commemoration know about Pierre Nora's work, where he calls these lieux de mémoire, these sites of memory. And he talks about them being sites of memory because the people who were part of these events often have passed away. So they're not living sites. They're not lieux de milieu, which is meeting sites. He said, we've really moved beyond that because the people have passed. And what I'm arguing is that we use our commemorative sites to make them meeting sites where we're really engaging with the conversations that need to be had. My colleague Alison Castell talks about one of the problems in dealing with memory, politics of memory, in dealing with atrocities and genocides and so on, is that we often talk about them as isolated events. The Armenian genocide happened. The Bosnian a genocide happened, Rwanda happened, Holocaust happened, and it makes it kind of an enclosed structure. Now what that does is it kind of makes us deal with the past, and France has done that, and I could talk a little bit about how it's done that with the Holocaust, but it doesn't necessarily get us to the conversations about who's in and who's out, really leaves the environment open for totalitarian rhetoric and cycles of violence. And while these sites and commemorations do mean a lot to the survivors, they're really, in my interviews with them, I interviewed 80 Holocaust survivors, many of them were pushing us all to really look towards what's happening right now. I'm just going to give you an example of some of these survivors and what they said because I was so moved by who they were. I was at a Holocaust commemoration event during the Remembrance Day in Washington, D.C., and I was sitting next to a very elderly woman who's probably not more than 80 pounds, slumped in her wheelchair. I thought she was blind and deaf, and we were listening to all these awards that were being given out for people who've done Holocaust research. And she grabbed my hand from her wheelchair and she looked at me and she said, "My name is Hannah. I survived Auschwitz. And what I want you to know is that it doesn't matter whether the children study the Holocaust." She said, "My son doesn't and my daughter does. But what matters is that you are a good person, good to Jew and good to non-Jew." And then she let go of my hand and slumped back in her chair. And I was so moved by this interaction, I really took her words to heart. And they were just reiterated to me again and again. Daniel Erzbettel, who survived Auschwitz with his brother when they were both children, told me that he just this past year won the highest Medal of Honor in France for his work after retirement in helping handicapped people, and talks to me about how much it hurts him to watch the children suffering today, and the look in the eyes of refugees that he understands so well. But he's really pushing us to talk about the present, even though I was there to hear about his story. He was not alone. I met another survivor in Argenteuil, France, which is just outside of Paris, and she interrupted our dinner about her life to check on the Syrian and Palestinian children. She got up, turned on the news, checked on the children, and then came back and talked to me. She's very active politically, she's on Facebook, and so on. And these people are very elderly at this point, but super passionate about our world today. And I brought some of them to commemorative sites, and they're old, it's difficult for them to go to these sites. And when I talked to the organizers of the sites, you know, they say that survivors don't really come anymore in many cases. They are too elderly, they're isolated, it's difficult for them to get around. And many of them, I don't know if they all wanted to go to these sites. So it really left me, and I'm sure many others who are working in this area of Holocaust commemoration and commemoration of other genocides, is what do you do with these spaces once you've commemorated them? You know, if you've traveled to Paris, you've seen the signs, you surely have seen the signs on almost every school noting the children who were rounded up by the Gestapo and taken away and killed in death camps. The Shoah Memorial has a prominent place along the Seine in the Marais neighborhood. A site commemorating deportations in Paris is right behind Notre Dame. I mean, they're very prominent. But what now do we do with these spaces? You know, if the survivors have passed away and the second and third generation Jews are leaving France because of resurgent anti-Semitism, well, they become sites of education, right? So a lot of school groups go and they learn about ethics and they learn about the past. But I think there's something even additionally that we need to be doing with these sites. France has two choices. I mean, it can learn to redefine what it means to be French, right? And have complicated discussions about what that means and how to create this idea of inclusion, or move towards Le Pen and the National Front Party, which is talking about returning to a pure France, which brings us back into those narratives of superior races, good and not good. We're back to very low levels of binary thinking, which not only are extremely dangerous and difficult, they're impossible. I mean, we are in a globalized world, people are moving about in record numbers, the Syrian refugee crisis is enormous. I do appreciate the desire and the complexity of retaining a French culture in the light of many people immigrating, and how to do that without creating exclusion, and how to do that without really perpetuating the cycles of violence. There are really wonderful organizations that work on this kind of thing as well, Sites of Conscience, Facing History, FASB, which uses ethical training at Auschwitz. There's a number of others. And I'm also happy to talk with anyone who's interested in doing this in their communities. Thank you for listening, and thank you for considering this deeper work that really needs to be done, that we're all really challenged to do in our communities. But I think that the continued trend of violence is not one that any of us or anyone watching this video would really like to see.